Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was great to be in Los Angeles last week for the art fairs and to see so many of you. This was my first time back in the city since the fires, and it was incredibly meaningful to reconnect with the LA art community, to show my support, and to hear firsthand about what people have been going through there. Despite the challenges, the energy throughout the week was strong. It felt like a moment where the art community truly came together. The gallery openings were packed, and Frieze on opening day was buzzing with activity. In this week's episode of the podcast, we recap Frieze Week in LA with Eileen Kinsella, senior market reporter at Artnet News. Eileen was on the ground covering the fairs, openings, and everything in between. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Eileen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to connect again.
Absolutely. We're excited to have you back on. So I think there was a lot of anticipation heading into this week and really a lot of uncertainty as we think about the LA fires and its impact, not just on the art scene there, but also on the broader community, as well as potentially a softening art market. How would you describe the overall ambiance in LA during the week? Did you notice shifts in out-of-town attendance compared to last year in previous editions? And how did factors like the fire and the art market impact just the overall vibes of the fair?
Yeah, I want to say that overall, the experience in LA was fantastic. You know, I do have prior years to use as context, and it was very touch and go immediately after the fires. Like myself and my colleagues were wondering in the thick of it, it was so uncertain. It was so devastating. Would there be movement forward? Would they be able to pull it off? And, just even gathering information from fair organizers or people that were participating when the fires died down and I started to ask around, it was sort of like, yeah, we're moving forward. And the galleries that had already signed up to be part of it were locked in. So they were going to continue with it. And I think overall, at some point after the fires stopped or they got them under the really major ones under control, there was a sense of like, let's move forward and do this because it's needed. And that happened, I feel like, on a number of levels. Even when I was speaking with Christine Messineo, the director of Frieze LA, she was just saying that, the impact goes far beyond the arts community. It's this tent that they build from scratch every year at Santa Monica Airport, and that involves not just art galleries and exhibitors and artists, but it also involves electricians and construction and engineers and food vendors. So that the ripple effect of going forward was very positive, and it seemed like very welcome at a time when people just wanted to take action and move forward.
Yeah, and you touched on this a little bit, but there was this debate that seemed to be happening, especially early on, right after the fires, as to whether or not the week should proceed. Do you feel like being there, looking back now, was there a consensus on if the right decision was in fact made to move forward and to have this fair week?
Yeah, I mean, I feel completely like, yeah, there probably was some sensitivity or concern of like, are you being tone deaf by moving forward with a major fair? And it was really a resounding no. I mean, by the time that I arrived at Frieze LA in the early hours on last Thursday, the 20th, the mood was like, again, I have previous years to compare it to. So it felt very enthusiastic, just jam packed. When you're walking up that road into the airport, you see a lot of the Frieze projects that are outdoors. The beautiful weather and great air also helped, but there was everything from, the swap meet by, I'll have to look up his name. There was a great swap meet where they were handing out these like free little trinkets and it was beautifully painted, to, some of the installations on the football field outside there. And I just had this sense of like, wow, people are really coming together and they're also really liking this and appreciating this. And, one thing I know you and I talked about it. This is probably one of the maybe not so rare, but it was like the vibe check was like the same with everybody that I talked to. It was like anyone who had been at Felix the day before was saying like, oh, it was a little bit quieter, and we're not sure what that's a reflection of. But that Frieze itself on the opening VIP preview day was really just like all out a success, enthusiasm, well attended. The only maybe wrinkle that I heard a little bit of was that international attendance was down. And that would make sense because, you or I were in the country and we know that, yeah, these wildfires are devastating, but we also know what LA is like. If you're looking, from Europe or afar and seeing that's the wildfire and you don't know much about LA, maybe that's going to influence your decision whether or not you're going to make an international trip there. But I do have to say, LA is very spread out, and the fires were to the north of Santa Monica. And we all know that there was devastation and effects on many artists, many people living in the Palisades and the nearby areas. But physically, at least, you didn't see any of that in like the Santa Monica area. I know that some galleries had delayed openings of shows in the immediate aftermath of the fires, but, for better or for worse, you didn't get like a sense of the devastation that had been occurring further up, although of course that's at the front of everybody's mind about relief efforts and recovery.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. And for any of our listeners who weren't at the fairs last week or really haven't been to LA in a while, the city is just so spread out that when I was there, I noticed unless you really specifically went to one of the neighborhoods that was affected by the fires, you wouldn't necessarily see any visible signs of the aftermath. So if you were just moving between fairs and galleries like I was, it wasn't something that you would encounter. And on another point you raised, I also noticed fewer international visitors compared to past years. Of course, Europe is very far from California. But I also felt like I noticed maybe fewer US collectors traveling in this year from places like New York, Texas, Florida. But that said, the opening day of Frieze, it was really busy, and the gallery openings around town were incredibly packed. And so it seemed like the LA art community really wanted to show up for one another, especially since this was the first major social gathering for the art world in LA since the fires. It just felt like a really positive moment, an opportunity for people to reconnect and celebrate art after going through such a difficult experience together. Did you feel that as well?
Yeah, it really did feel like everybody was coming together in a great way. And, it was notable to me that even when Frieze announced that they were going to go ahead with the fair, and that was sometime in mid-January, and they said they were going to do it in a way that, genuinely supports the local economy and the arts community. I think that there was a very thoughtful attention to detail with that. And one of the things that I wanted to mention that I know resonated with fair leaders and with a lot of the galleries there was this Frieze Arts Alliance. It's a new initiative, and it involved about 20 museums. They had the Guggenheim in New York, the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, ICA Miami, and all of the alliance members said they were going to use their acquisition budgets to purchase artworks at the fair, and that will support both artists and recovery efforts. And to me, that when it was described to me, it just sounded like a very great supportive way. You're having conversations within the arts community, and curators are doing like asking, what can we do? And then it was like, well, we can go to our trustees and raise money. And it's really like, I feel like a very hands-on direct way of showing up to support Los Angeles and the arts community and the galleries in a very like direct response way to the devastation that happened. And then you saw other things like certain galleries at the fair dedicated either all or parts of their booths to fire relief. One of them was Victoria Miro Gallery from London, gave over part of its stand to works from other participating galleries, and the sales were benefiting the LA Arts Community Fire Relief Fund. I want to make sure I said that okay. And not only was it a very thoughtful way of support, like the booth was just great. Like I enjoyed all of the works that were there, from like one by Max Hooper Schneider, which had this like I don't know if you saw it. It was like this rolling metal ball that was carving out messages and sand, to pieces by Kakai Kiki, the partnership. I don't know if I pronounced that right. The partnership between Takashi Murakami Yeah, overall, I really appreciated the energy and the effort behind those relief support, and even just casually speaking to one art advisor who was there with clients, she was saying, I have some clients in tow, and it's a good sign to me that when we approach a dealer and ask about a work, a lot of them already spoken for, the ones that were interested in buying. And so she said that's, a great sign and indication that things really are selling.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about sales this year at the fair, of course. How would you assess the overall sales performance at Frieze this year? And can you share a few highlights or trends that stood out to you?
I mean, first off, I always take it with a grain of salt when I hear that things in the $2 and $3 million range were sold. Actually, maybe it capped out around something as high as 2.8 million at David Zwirner for an Elizabeth Peyton painting, and she's one of my favorite artists. I love her, so I'm happy to hear that. But a lot of times when I hear about seven-figure sales, I assume that maybe some of those were at least in the works, pre-fair, like pre-fair sales. But beyond that, and I know the market is a little bit softer, I think it's sort of like a continuation of the patterns that we've been seeing where really in-demand artists are still doing, pretty well. I did hear of sellouts at both Marian Ibrahim, of this artist, a Haitian American artist named Patrick Eugene, who I've sort of been watching for the past 2 years and has really beautiful portrait paintings. They're inspired by his Haitian American heritage. And then at Kordansky, I hope I pronounced this right, Maya Cruz Palaleo, another artist that I've been sort of seeing around for years. I first saw her at Tamar Grane in Tribeca when he had a gallery there. And it's nice to just keep seeing her work showing up and being represented by, this big gallery. So I think there's a lot of energy behind maybe those sales taking place at the actual fair where it's like, under 100,000, emerging artists, kind of buzzy. And I was hearing a lot of that. So I think that that's a good sign. I don't doubt that things are still challenging in the market. I think it's important for galleries to show up there and show their work, but I think the overall sense of caution that we had was sort of like overhanging the market all of last year is still very much there. So like I am being optimistic about what the scene was like, post fire, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think that the market in general is still very cautious and challenging.
Yeah, I think you assessed the market really well. People have been asking me how the fair went and what the market felt like. And overall, I do think there's better energy and stronger demand in 2025, maybe compared to late last year, heading into the looming US election. But at the same time, I think the market remains very selective. So the most in-demand artists, especially when galleries bring really strong examples by those artists, they're still selling it very well. But for works that are overpriced or by artists who aren't as coveted or maybe their careers have stalled, demand just isn't there in the same way that it once was. And selling those works at even current primary prices has become a lot more challenging for a lot of galleries. It's interesting, a few years ago, it felt like almost every gallery had a great fair every fair, right? A sold out booth or a near sold out booth. It was almost guaranteed. Now I think it really depends on the strength of each gallery's program. So some galleries with really strong programs or really standout presentation at a fair, they'll still do very well at a fair. But maybe the next booth over, they might struggle if the material just isn't as compelling. And one interesting point that a gallerist mentioned to me at the fair was about the internal dynamics of these sales at the galleries. I think there's often a lot of pressure on the sales team at galleries to perform and make the fair a success, to sell the art successfully. But this gallerist pointed out that in many ways, what's just as crucial, or even more crucial in this moment, is the role of the artist liaison at the gallery. They're the ones who are in constant communication with their artists, and it's their job, as the gallerist said, to make sure that they get out of and the artist produces really the strongest possible work for the fair. Because at the end of the day, if the work isn't great, the sales team can only do so much. But if the material is strong, it'll sell. So I thought that was a really interesting perspective that I hadn't heard before. Now, shifting gears a bit, I also wanted to ask you about the gallery shows around town during Frieze Week. It's really amazing just to see how many galleries are now in LA, and they all seem to time major exhibitions to open during this week, and it really just makes it such an exciting moment on the art calendar. How important do you think the gallery shows are, and how do they contribute to the overall success of the week?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know that a lot of galleries are strategic about having, really important, interesting shows open right at the time that Frieze opens. And that's always fun to see. It's always fun to see what galleries pull out. And for instance, when I first got to town, I went to go see the David Hammond show that's at Frieze, I'm sorry, at Hauser and Wirth downtown. And that was fascinating. Well, I guess to start, when you first walk into the gallery, they have a George Roy show at the front, and I was, there to see Hammonds, but happy to see that show first. And the Hammonds exhibit is super interesting because it's not for sale, and it's the first time that it's been shown in 20 years. It was shown in Ace Gallery in Tribeca after 9/11, and it got a lot of attention then, and it was restaged here. Again, it's super interesting. You have to surrender your phone to this like locked case, and then you get a blue flashlight and you wander around this really dark space with only your little blue light emanating from it. And it's called Concerto in Black and Blue. And then you see other people in there. You sort of like navigating to not bump into walls or other people. And I thought it was kind of fascinating that such a large scale non-commercial show was staged 20 years after it first appeared. And meanwhile, at their West Hollywood gallery, they had a show of Charles Gaines and a talk with the artist. And that's a rarity. So clearly, like really pulling out top programming and hoping to get visitors in the door. It shows you really the effort that goes on year round in LA, because obviously we know it's not easy to navigate between all these different neighborhoods, and you really have to be strategic about what you see. So they're really pulling out all the stops to make it, some of the top artists and top programming that they have. And I know you got around too. Like, I'm curious what some of your favorite gallery shows were.
Yeah, whenever I prepare for Frieze LA, I always map out the gallery shows around town that I want to see on Google Maps, and I really try to create the most efficient route. As you said, LA, it's just so spread out. The traffic is unbearable, and unfortunately, it just slows you down, and there's just never enough time to see everything. A few shows that stood out to me, I really enjoyed Kelly Akashi's exhibition at Lisson Gallery. She, of course, was one of the LA artists that was significantly impacted by the fires. A lot of the works that were supposed to go into that show were destroyed, and she made some new works right before the show. Her opening was packed with people really showing their support for her. Those glass sculptures, I just can't even comprehend how she makes them. They're just so delicate looking. I actually get nervous standing near some of them, afraid that I'm just going to bump into one. I also really enjoyed stopping by Kohn Gallery. Michael Kohn, he put together a group exhibition actually celebrating his 40th anniversary as a gallery, and a really incredible milestone when you think about it. And I bumped into Michael, had a chance to talk with him for a bit, and he was sharing some amazing stories from his early days in the gallery. He had some Warhols and Herrings that were in the exhibition. He was talking about what it was like to sell those artists' works in LA in the 80s. Another interesting highlight was Lisa Yuskavage's show at David Zwirner. I hadn't been to the new Zwirner building in LA yet. It's huge. It's massive. It would fit right in with the galleries in Chelsea and New York. And I think it signals that, their long-term commitment to the city. A few other interesting standouts. Pace Gallery. It was a very unexpected and cool group show curated by Robert Nava about monsters. I posted a few pictures from that, and Nicole Eisman has a painting in the show, and she started texting or messaging with me on Instagram about the show, and she was really happy to be a part of it. Right across the street, I actually walked across the street, so you can do some walking in LA. Leslie Vance's show at David Kordansky was really beautiful. And then I saw Issy Wood's exhibition at Michael Warner. That space was really interesting. You actually have to walk through a retail clothing store to get into the gallery. So just kind of felt very LA. All these LA galleries, they have personality to them. They're not just the white boxes that you see in a lot of New York galleries. I had plenty more of shows on my list, but as always, you just run out of time. So one final question before we let you go. So you're not in LA any longer. Looking back, reflecting on the week, how successful do you think it was, and what significance does it hold for LA's growing art scene? It's really its evolving role in the broader U.S. art market.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the face of it and overall vibe check, sales wise, it was a really great success, and I think it was really needed. I mean, if it hadn't happened, as I understand it, when there was uncertainty and there was talk about would it move forward or not, it wouldn't have been a postponement. It would have had to been a cancellation. That's my understanding from having talked to the directors, and I think that would have really been a shame because the way that the fair landscape is now, I don't know when you could have had recast it. Like if we get into March, we're already talking about Hong Kong, Art Basel, Hong Kong, and then May is Frieze in New York, which is, obviously their own fair. They don't want to jeopardize one of their own fairs on the lineup. So overall, I think it's really good that it moved forward and that it happened. I don't think there's anybody that regrets it. And, there was also just some great satellite fair programming. Like for the first time, the Post Fair, it was originally called, I guess, Post Office at the old Santa Monica Post Office downtown happened. It was just fun to pop over to that after Frieze. I was organized by Chris Sharp, who's a dealer. And it was just I thought, it was quick. You could walk through it pretty quickly, but it was sort of just like this flair, so almost like an anti-Frieze, and I don't mean that in a bad way because I do love the Frieze Art Fair, but it just had this sort of like maybe more casual vibe, and it was a very interesting mix of like gallery names that I've never seen before alongside ones that I know like PPOW or Spruthmager. So that was interesting, and I just think that's sort of reflective of like the energy that's out there now. And when you say as the LA art scene as a whole, it's not completely unlike Manhattan in that you have like these movements and these pockets where like, you see like galleries flock to a certain part of Chinatown in New York City, and then they move and then they go back to the Lower East Side. And now Tribeca is really kind of booming again and looking really beautiful. I like watching that happen in LA, even though it's obviously harder to track and harder to follow, but you do see that same kind of energy and flow where it's like, a cluster of galleries open in one spot in West Hollywood. And then there's like a lot of attention and energy there. And I know people are still trying to figure it out, dealers included. But overall, I see it all as a positive. And, I did have in my story that British dealer Timothy Taylor had always felt like he needed some persuading to actually commit to LA. Like he had done Frieze London a bunch of times or Frieze New York, and he has galleries in New York, but that he was kind of finally persuaded to come to LA this year. I don't know how much he wanted his people to share that with me because he was kind of laughing about it. But he did say how happy he was to be there, how many people he saw that he recognized, and he was pleasantly surprised by that in LA, and also did really well sales wise. I mean, shared that in my report, but he did wonderfully. So if that's any sign of people testing it out and being confident and being committed, I think that's great.
Eileen, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us recap a really incredible week in Los Angeles. If our listeners haven't checked out your coverage of the fair, they definitely should. And where can we find you on social media as well as all of your writings?
Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate that. And yeah, of course, check out coverage on Artnet News, which is just news.artnet.com. And on social media, on Twitter, I'm Kinsella EK. And on Instagram, I'm EB Kinsella. And I really do try to, recap what I see. I put some of my highlights from the Frieze Art Fair on there. And obviously, no shortage of great works. And you can look on there to see some of my favorites.
Perfect. We definitely will. Thanks so much again, Eileen. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Adam, no problem. Anytime. Thank you.